This is tape number 1 from the series, Shame, A Gift from God, The Legacy of Abuse.
This first tape is entitled Shame is an Emotion, just to bring it into perspective as to what it is. Let me time myself. Okay. Let me first bring up the issue of codependence to show you where this whole thing fits in so you can have some idea about what I'm talking about. Let me define codependence. And this is just something I made up. This is just what I think it is. If I may be so bold to say that I think codependence is a state of dis-ease caused by child abuse that renders a person unable to do 5 different things in their daily living. Really, codependence is about being an immature person because nobody was there to teach you how to act like an adult. Trouble is, we grow up and act just like our parents. And most of us weren't raised by adults. We were just raised by children masquerading as adults who taught us how to be children, adult children. And that's the problem. Codependence really, I don't think, is about an emotional illness at all. I think it's more about our immaturity issues. Adults can do 5 things. They know how to esteem themselves from within, or in other words, they know how to love themselves. They know how to experience an internal sense of their own value. Adults know how to set boundaries with other folks. They know how to set limits on incoming reality, the reality of other people, and so they can protect themselves from other people. And they can also set limits on their own reality to keep themselves from offending other people. Adults can do that. They have boundaries. Adults can also own their own reality and share it politically with others. They know who they are, in other words, and they know when to let that out of their mouth and show people who they are. And they know when to hold it in and not display it. They know how the politics of displaying their reality. Basically, they know when to let it out and when to hold it in. Adults take full responsibility for their issues around needing and wanting. They don't have problems with that. They take responsibility for that. They don't whine and hang and expect other people to do it for them. On the other hand, they can ask others for help without shame or guilt. So they can be interdependent. And the last things an adult can do is they can be moderate in the internal experience of their own reality and the external expression of their reality. In other words, they're centered and moderate. In the disease, you see, codependents have trouble doing those things. They have trouble esteeming themselves appropriately or experiencing appropriate levels of self-esteem. They either see themselves as better than and have too much esteem, false esteem, or they see themselves as worth less and have too little sense of esteem and have trouble generating it from within properly. Codependents have trouble setting functional boundaries with other people. Codependents have trouble experiencing and knowing what their reality is and knowing how to share it politically. What they do is they share it with unsafe people and hold it and keep it in around safe people. In other words, they go into a market and then they pass through the grocery line. And as they're passing the bag boy, they inform the bag boy they're an incest survivor. In case you don't understand what I mean. Then they go to their therapist's office about an hour later and they sit in there and refuse to explain the fact that they're an incest survivor. So they withhold it from people they ought to be sharing it with and tell all these other people in their life information that's none of those other people's business. And they feel safe and centered doing this. Now that's ridiculous. Who does that kind of thing? A very immature person that doesn't know how to be political with their own reality. That was a very hard one to learn. I kept doing it a little different. I'd share it with offenders who'd take the information and blast me back in the face with it. And then people who weren't really victimizing me, I'd withhold it from and be real paranoid around them. It was absolutely crazy. Codependents have trouble addressing their adult issues around needing and wanting. What they do is again seen in 2 extremes. They either are too dependent, expecting others to take care of their needs and wants, or they're anti-dependent. In other words, they know what they need and want, and they'll be doggone if they'll let anybody help them with that. Most men fall in that second category, and most women fall in the first, at least from about 35 on up in this culture. We also have another, in terms of those issues around dependency, needs, and wants, there's another extreme that's seen in the disease. It kind of falls in that anti-dependent category, and that's the codependent who's needless and wantless. That's the sickest one of all when we look at this particular symptom. And that's the one that has no idea whatsoever what their needs and wants are. They just kind of get them met by taking care of other people. And they're needless and wantless. These are the people that really fail to ever take care of themselves. and codependents have a hard time dealing with their reality in moderation. Inside themselves, their reality is experienced as very shut down or booming. In other words, when they tune into themselves, they can barely get a grasp of it. They don't really know who they are, or it's booming. It's like they don't feel anything at all, or they're raging inside. Then when they go to express it, they either let it out in a peep or they let it out in a roar, so they offend other people with their reality. Letting it out with a peep is just as offensive as letting it out with a roar. Have you ever heard anybody letting their reality out with a peep? Like that? What do you do when somebody goes, peep? What do you do when they do that? You strain. You try to get right up near them to hear what in the world they're saying. Pretty soon you're screaming, and they're getting more silent. And then they accuse you of offending them. But what started the whole thing in the first place is they either didn't let it out or they let it out in a peep. So how you experience it internally and how you let it out is part of the disease, when inside it's all up or all down and you let it out all down or all up. Both are equally as sick as the other. One just looks better than the other. That's the disease of codependence. And the reason why I brought it up before I went into other issues around shame as an emotion is because I'm going to refer to these symptoms many times to show you how shame is interrelated with this symptomatology. There are also 5 other secondary symptoms, what I call secondary symptoms of this disease. And I want to pass by those real quickly, but I'm not going to be discussing them at all. The secondary symptoms have to do with control issues. Control is about, in the disease, is about giving yourself permission to tell somebody else who they ought to be, what they ought to look like, what they ought to be thinking, what they ought to be feeling, and what they ought to be doing or not doing. You're in your disease whenever you're doing that. But it's a secondary symptom caused by not knowing who you are, boundary failure, and lack of appropriate levels of self-esteem. The second secondary symptom is that codependents have problems with resentments, adult resentment issues. The third symptom, secondary symptom, is codependents by and large have spirituality issues. The fourth secondary symptom is that codependents avoid reality through the use of addictions, physical illness, and mental illness. We can get so crazy we don't even know what reality is. That's what mental illness oftentimes is about in this disease. We can also get physically ill from not facing reality, and we can use addictions to avoid reality. I see it as a secondary symptom, although it becomes a primary issue if you are suffering from addiction issues and trying to recover from codependence, certainly. Since codependency recovery is about growing up, in my opinion, and facing reality, how can you face reality if you use addictions to avoid reality? Which is one of the key problems in recovery, because so often we go into addictions treatment first and then try to do codependence treatment, but what we do is we go from addiction to addiction to addiction to addiction, all the time avoiding reality and expecting to get into codependence recovery. You got to have reality on board. You can't be medicating reality through a use of addiction if you want to face your codependence issues. Codependency recovery, really more than anything else at all, is about facing reality, not avoiding it. If you're using addictions to medicate reality, you can forget codependence recovery. But anyway, codependence recovery is about growing up, facing reality, grieving, reparenting the self, and forgiving others who have offended you in your family of origin and in your adult life too. And forgiving yourself for the harmful effects of being a codependent in the first place, and there are many harmful effects from your codependency on others and yourself. So codependence recovery is a mammoth job. Understanding shame and codependence is part of that recovering process. Now let's just go on. I want to go on now and just discuss the issue of shame and put it into perspective. What we're talking about when we talk about shame is we're merely talking about emotion. Where it fits in on these primary symptoms is right in here under reality. Shame is part of your reality, and it is simply an emotion and nothing else. It's not anything woo or special at all. It's just an emotion. Emotions, if you're normal, not codependent, come from your thinking. As you think, you create your emotions. As you think certain things, you will generate the experience of shame. Now, just as a mention here about feeling reality and that third core symptom, let me say something else about emotions in general. Emotions are just, as I said before, one part of our reality. Our reality has 4 parts to it, and our reality makes up a sense of who we are. Emotions then are just a fourth of who we are, but they're extremely important because each one of them brings us certain gifts. Probably the main gift your emotions bring you is a sense of aliveness, which is very, very important. It's how we connect to the world through our bodies. You know, if you just spin around in your thinking, does it really matter? Have you ever thought about that? If you just stay up in your brain, what matters? Nothing matters at all if you stay up in your brain and don't feel. It's only when we get our brain connected to our feeling reality that we really have a reaction to whatever is going on in our environment. So our emotions are a way that we connect our bodies to the world and have a sense of aliveness, and that's very important. The other thing our emotions do is each one brings us gift, but we have a problem in this culture. It's part of the issue around child abuse. We have a problem with our culture and emotions in that there is a general attitude in this culture that to feel is immature. How many people in here are struggling to feel as part of their codependence recovery? Yeah. We have an attitude in this culture that if you feel at all, you're immature. If you feel moderately, you're emotional. And if you feel strongly, you've gone into the realm of craziness. What does that do for us in terms of recovering from this disease? It keeps us from feeling our feelings. That's why most people can't feel them, because they not only have been told to sit down, shut up, and don't express them, they've also learned to tune their emotions out, because their emotions is what brings reality to them, and they don't want to face reality. And the third reason is there's a general attitude in this culture that to have feelings somehow is very immature. And what I know is in recovery, since I believe recovery from codependence is about growing up, having your emotions is indeed about your maturity. It takes a mature person to feel their feelings. It takes a mature person, too, to control them and not let them out in such a way that they offend other people with them. But anyway, there is that general attitude that really serves to keep people really shut down with their emotions. There's also some other crazy deals about emotions in general, and that is that some emotions men aren't to have, and some emotions women aren't to have, and some emotions nobody's to have, which is really screwball. In this culture, generally speaking, we say that women aren't to be angry, that if a woman is angry, she's a witch, or something worse than that. But since when I get taped, I don't swear, I won't say it. But anyway, most people consider an angry woman a witch. Men aren't to have fear, on the other hand. If you're a male and you have fear, you're a big coward. So individually in this culture, we rob people of their emotions in general, and then specific, taking fear from men and anger from women. So they're missing parts of who they are. The third crazy thing about this is that no one is to feel their pain, which is probably why codependence is rampant. Nobody's to feel pain, and everybody has a God-given right to medicate it away, no matter in any fashion you can do it. All you have to do is watch the TV for a while and see how much invitations we get to shut down our pain. The other emotion that is absolutely totally avoided is the emotion of shame. It's even buried deeper than pain. Pain we get an invitation to not experience, but with shame we don't even talk about it. It's only recently that we've been talking about it. I know where I'm from, we've been talking about shame for 10, 12 years, but I remember years and years and years we were blabbing away about it, but nobody else was ever mentioning it. Now I can see it start coming into the literature. You hear it on the TV, you see it in movies, which is really shocking. I know who's ever writing that script is a codependent in recovery. It's really kind of strange. They're talking about shame, but that is a recent experience. Up until very recently, shame was not mentioned, which is a problem. So we've gotten a huge invitation not to experience that at all. Now, to kind of straighten out this experience of feelings, when I'm working with a codependent and helping them pull out of that and begin to own their own feeling reality over here and teach them that as they think they produce their feeling realities, one of the things I do is introduce a principle around feelings, and that principle is this: all our feelings are wonderful. There's nothing wrong with any one of our feelings. It's actually only when we carry take on feelings from other people and add them to our own, that we go on overwhelm, and the feeling experience of our own plus somebody else's makes us feel awful. When we're just feeling our own emotions and nobody else's, most of us find that we can stand them. In fact, I've gone through some really crazy experiences with people. You know, I have dealt with people over the years that have never felt a feeling. And then I come along and I teach somebody how to feel their feelings. Do you know how to feel your feelings? You know how to go back and feel your feelings when you can't feel them? You know how to do that? Anybody ever tell you how? It's real simple. If you pay attention to your physical body, you will find out that when you are feeling a feeling that your brain won't tell you what it is, just pay attention to what's going on with your body. You can begin to tell what you're feeling. For example, generally speaking, when you're feeling your own shame, you feel kind of hot behind your face. When you're feeling fear, you kind of have a general spreading feeling through your chest. When you're feeling pain, oftentimes your heart hurts. Feel shame, or guilt, you have kind of a gnawing feeling in your gut. A lot of times to get our emotions back, to know what they really are, we have to start paying attention to our own anatomy and physiology in order to figure out what they are. If you start tuning into that, your mind will begin to understand what these emotions are, because your body will be feeling them whether your brain is tuned into it or not. Anyway, getting back to the emotions, what I teach people is all their feelings are wonderful and they must learn how to embrace them and express them appropriately. Each one brings us a gift. I make them memorize this so they don't avoid them, and they start paying attention to them. The reason why I tell them to pay attention to them is because each emotion helps us deal with what's going on in our life. It's our emotions that tell us really what's going on. For example, and by the way, I teach people to think about these in terms of 7 emotions and not worry about all those others, which are generally either one of these basic 7 feelings or a combination of these basic 7 feelings, and I'll tell you they come in pairs. The first 2 I always think about that come together are pain and joy. Those 2 are bedfellows. Pain and joy, oftentimes they're felt at the same time. The gift of our pain is that it helps us change. Without pain, none of us would ever change. In other words, pain is probably the emotion that does more for us than any other emotion in recovery, because what do we have to do in recovery from codependence? We have to grow up and stop blaming other people for our problems. Pain is the one motivator that will help people do that. I have never met anybody, like at the Meadows, who came in for treatment, that got anywhere in treatment when they could not feel their own pain. Without pain, you can't do any of the job of treatment or growing up or anything. You got to be in enough pain to do that. So the gift pain gives us is a gift of growth. And it's a wonderful emotion. Oh, I know what I wanted to tell you. I've dealt with people that I was trying to make, feel their feelings again. They call me up on the phone and say, I'm hurting. I said, what are you hurting about? And then they give this long line of all this stuff they're hurting about. I said, oh, goody, goody. They say, what do you mean? I said, it's your own pain. You can stand it now. Call me back tomorrow, and between now and then, just keep telling yourself, this is my pain and I can stand it. This is my pain and I can stand it. This is my anger and I can stand it. This is my guilt and I can stand it. This is my joy and I can stand it. And you will find by tomorrow you can stand it. They call me back tomorrow and say, how you doing? I could stand it as long as I kept telling myself I could stand my own feelings. That's another trick to use on yourself. As long as it's your own feeling, let me tell you, you can stand it, and you better learn to stand it, because without them, you're not going to get anywhere in this world. But the gift of our pain is that of growth. The gift from our joy is hope. It's our joy that gives us hope, which is a wonderful emotion. The next 2 that kind of go together are anger and fear for some reason. Oftentimes those are imbalanced too. If you feel more powerful than something coming at you, you get angry. If you feel less powerful, you get fearful. That's kind of how the 2 of them go together. But anyway, our anger gives us power. Our anger gives us power and energy. Have you ever noticed when you were really ticked off how fast you cleaned your house? When I'm really ticked off and mumbling under my breath about what an SOB, dab, 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 dab is, I can clean my house in about 2 hours. And if I don't have that as a motivator, it generally takes me about a day, day and a half. Anger is a motivator. By the way, anger is a wonderful thing. I have developed literally everything that I know out of resentment. Resentment is just another fancy term for being angry. All my recovery, either from my addiction issues or from my codependence, is on a resentment. So I don't see resentments as terrible things unless you're spinning around trying to figure out how to get somebody sufficiently punished and giving yourself an ulcer over it. Other than that, resentments, because it is about anger, can be very beneficial for us because they're motivating. They're motivating, and anger gives you a sense of power, which helps you also protect yourself. But anyway, fear, on the other hand, alerts us to danger in our environment and allows us to what? Protect ourselves. Protect ourselves. Fear is a wonderful emotion. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It tells us that there is something dangerous in our environment, and we'd better take a look at that and stop avoiding facing whatever it is. The next two emotions that go together are shame and guilt. The gift of guilt is that it brings us our values and our integrity. Shame is a gnawing feeling in the gut that comes about whenever you're breaking your own rules or operating outside your own value system. So as we feel guilt, our brain can automatically tell us that something's going on where we're breaking our own rules, and if we want to have integrity and follow our values, we've got to stop whatever we're doing. Shame, on the other hand, is another issue I'm not going to go into right at the moment. But shame and guilt kind of go together and often are very, very, very confused. Remember this, though, for when I'm going on later, that when you experience your own guilt, it is simply a gnawing feeling in the gut that alerts you to the fact that something's wrong, that you're not following your own rules. The last emotion that I discuss and teach people to start tracking, which everybody can track most of the time, is lust. Lust is emotion too, that comes about from what you're thinking. And when your brain is telling you that you're looking at something that is sexually inviting to you, then what's going to happen is you'll start to feel the emotion of lust. So it's another very, very important emotion. And by the way, I don't have time to invite you to answer questions around that stuff in this particular tape series. But I will tell you, I go down through those lists of emotions all the time with people, and I don't tell them about lust. And then I say, what other emotions do you think? There's one more that I would talk about. Nobody ever gets it. That's another emotion that we treat just like shame. It's like, you're not to talk about it. Don't mention it. We all do it, but don't let anybody know you do it. Which is crazy. Just nuts. You better pay attention to when that's going on so you can control it. Or increase it according to what's safe or appropriate. If you don't pay attention to it and it's going on, you're going to be in deep trouble. That's a very, very powerful emotion. You better pay attention to it. It alerts you to the fact that something in your environment is sexually arousing. It's a wonderful emotion, just like any of those other emotions. But what needs to be in recovery is that we need to be able to set limits on those emotions, so we don't let them out into our environment in such a way that we offend people with the expression of our emotion or the behavior surrounding it. We have data coming into our brains all the time. We assign meaning to that data. As we assign meaning to that data, which is called our thinking, we create our emotions. That's the connection. I'll tell you, in recovery, when our thinking is straightened out because we've reduced the amount of immature thinking we indulge ourselves in, and we're also connected to our emotions, we get that wonderful experience called being centered in recovery that makes most people feel like an adult. Getting our thinking straightened out and connected to our emotions, and all 7 emotions, is an extremely important part of our recovering process. Now I want to tell you something about this too. It's kind of a bias of mine. I find it really irritating. Now that I got over it, naturally, I can do an inventory on you. One of the things that I notice is that people judge their recovery by how much joy they have in their life. Are you all doing that too? It's like you don't have recovery because you're not happy? Yeah. Now that's immature thinking. It is immature thinking. Thank you very much. I always like people who support me. Have my bias. If we just whittle our emotions down to 7, and we rattle all those off, pain and joy and fear and anger and shame and guilt and lust, why should you feel joy more than you feel the rest of those? It's immature thinking to think that you're going to feel joy more than 1/7 of the time. In recovery, if you're doing recovery, you're going to be experiencing all those emotions. And you shouldn't be experiencing one more than the other. In other words, you're going to have about as much pain in your life as you're going to have joy in your life, as you're going to have shame in your life, as you're going to have guilt in your life, as you're going to have lust in your life. Hopefully that's another wonderful emotion, as long as you don't let it out of control. In other words, don't gauge I would tell you not to engage your recovery by how much joy you have. That's just one emotion, and normal people only get that a seventh of the time. And they live within that parameter. And I think if you can remove the cultural bias about emotions are a terrible thing and just let yourself feel them and say to yourself, hey, this is okay. It's only fear. It's only anger. It's only lust. It's only this, that, and the other thing. And hey, now I get some joy. Isn't that wonderful? But recovery's about feeling all that stuff. Are you going to get into balance? I will tell you that's been an important part of my own recovery. I used to have that bias that if I wasn't happy, something was wrong and I wasn't in recovery. And I have found in recovery I feel all that stuff, and now instead of, well, it was just happened today at the dinner table when Pat and I were eating, he brought up something that irritates me and also brings me some pain, and I was sitting there going, God, I don't like this, and look how centered he is as he's talking about all this stuff, and he was a little bit angry and in some pain. And I'm going, I shouldn't be feeling this anger, I shouldn't be having this pain, and I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute. Feeling some anger and some pain about what he's talking about is normal. Why don't you just say to yourself, you can stand this and get centered and go on like any other adult does. And I recentered myself in doing that, made myself feel better. Gotta get used to the levels of these emotions we're gonna have. We're gonna have all of them if we're tuned into ourselves. Normal people feel all that. I have a motto too that I got. I think I heard it first from Pat, and then I heard a guy named Fred Downing mention it. I used to pay attention when Fred said it. And the motto is, hug your demons or they'll bite you in the ass. Fred is a Lutheran minister, and he has this kind of English, I can't do it, I can't mimic things, but he has this English kind of thing in his voice, and he used to get up there and say, and hug your demons and they'll bite you in the ass. And the way he said that, it sounded like he was saying a saintly word when he said ass. It was real funny. And so I used to listen to him say that all the time. But anyway, hug your demons or they'll bite you in the ass is about embracing reality. Emotions is one part of your reality you better embrace. Now, shame is just an emotion, and a very special one because of what happens to kids when they're abused. Now, shame is different than guilt, often mixed up with guilt, but there's a difference here. When you feel shame, and it's your own shame, it feels like mild to moderate embarrassment. I always remember that when I'm feeling my own shame, I am embarrassed. Nothing more, nothing less. The other thing about shame, and when it's your own shame, is that it comes about when your brain is thinking something. Thinking two things. Number one, I've made a mistake. And number two, somebody else is looking at me as I've made this mistake. In other words, I would probably feel my own shame if I fell off the podium and all of you looked at me, right? But if I fell off the podium and I was in this room all by myself, do you think I'd feel shame? No, I'd probably hurt. And that's it, I'd feel some pain, but I wouldn't feel shame. Shame is a public emotion. Just like how you know how when you pick your nose in the bathroom and nobody else is watching you, how you don't feel shame about that, you just gouge away at yourself. But if somebody you care about happened to see you doing that, what do you think you'd feel? Embarrassed. See, the shame is a public emotion. It's different than guilt. Shame is about embarrassment. Guilt is that gnawing feeling in your gut when you break your own values. They're two very different emotions. In other words, you can feel guilt all by yourself in your closet as you think about how you operated outside your values and broke your own rules. But you cannot feel shame all by yourself in your closet when you're doing something like that. You won't feel anything. You'll just enjoy it. It's only when people see your fallibility, your imperfection, that you feel shame. It's a public thing. But I'm only talking about your own shame. I'm not talking about carried or induced shame. And the important thing to remember is it feels like embarrassment, and the other thing is that as you're feeling your own shame, you do not have a drop in your own sense of worth. Your own sense of value, your own sense of esteem, your own sense of worthwhileness does not take a plunge when you feel your own shame. Shame, another thing I would tell you to get you kind of centered on this issue of shame is that shame alerts you to your own fallibility. In other words, shame tells you your poop smells. That's the other thing shame tells you. Now that's a wonderful statement I just said there. Because what does that do for you? When you know your poop smells, what do you know about everybody else? Theirs does too. And that's wonderful to know that. Why? Because it helps you deal with your perfect imperfection. The only thing perfect about you is your imperfection. When you know your poop smells and you know everybody else's does, do you realize that that's a leveler? It's a leveler. It tells you that everybody else is perfectly imperfect too, and you don't need to worry about it. In other words, everybody makes mistakes. Best thing you can do, by the way, whenever you make a mistake is, and again, you only feel shame when somebody's looking at you and aware that you made a mistake. Best thing to do is own it and say, I screwed up, or you can say something else too. If you like to swear. They can't do anything else to you once you've admitted it. And you can own it. You can own it because you know everybody else makes those kinds of mistakes too. And if they don't own that, something's wrong. If they can't own the fact that they're perfectly imperfect, what do they have? They have a disease called codependence, and they're doing it in front of you right now. So our own shame, it brings us a gift of two things. Since it tells us our poop smells and everybody else does, which gets us comfortable with our perfect imperfection, what it does is it allows us to own ourselves as perfectly imperfect, which allows us to be accountable for who we are. Now that's important. What does accountability mean? Accountability means that we have the ability to note the impact of our behavior on other people, note the impact of our reality on others. So the gift shame brings us is that of accountability. In other words, when we can feel our own shame, it allows us to own who we are and how it affects other people. So the gift it brings is that of accountability. Another wonderful gift that it brings us is spirituality. And that's very important for us too. The reason why it does that is very interesting. I think shame is the source of spirituality, by the way. I have a whole tape series on that. It's a long discussion, and I'll try to tell you about it really briefly. But basically, our own shame tells us our poop smells, which sets us up to be in a relationship with a power greater than self. You realize that when you don't feel shame, you don't need a higher power because you're the higher power. Have you noticed that about shameless people or people that can't feel their shame? They're set up to be a higher power. And it's because they lack shame. Again, shame is what alerts a person to how their reality is impacting others. A shameless person doesn't give a rat fink about how they are affecting others. They think they have a right to go out in that environment and be and do whatever they want to do, that they have a right to take from other people and use other people. That's a shameless person. When you have a shame, when you have the sense of your own shame on board and are able to feel it, as you impact people and impact people adversely and they tell you about it, it's your shame that puts you in the experience of being able to hear others tell you about adverse impact you've had on them. Anybody able to do that would know they need to have a power greater than themselves to help them. Have you noticed that in recovery? It's part of what makes recovery difficult. Have you noticed that about recovery? That on one level, for those of you who feel worthless, feeling better, beginning to feel better and not so worthless is an important thing. But the other thing about it is that in recovery, one of the things we have to do is we have to pay attention to our impact on others. I personally hate to do that. I noticed, for example, in my relationship with Pat, that I can do an inventory on him and feel very free to tell him how aggravating it is to live with him. Mainly it's aggravating because he has different values. And he does things that are different, like I was really aggravated kind of riding over in the car today. I hope he's not here. I don't see him. I can always talk about him better when he's not here. It's easier. Anyway, we're riding in the car and he likes to play that radio. I think he's deaf or something. He plays it real loud. And what happens to me, because I've got chronic shock syndrome, is that loud talking and all that stuff just after a while just makes me agitated like that, and I just hate it. But is he doing something wrong? No, he's just listening to the radio the way he likes it. I always want to say, hey, let me turn some rock and roll on to jangle your nerves. He likes all that talking. I like the rock and roll, That settles me down. The other stimulates him. Mine stimulates him and settles me down. Who's right, who's wrong? Nobody's right or wrong. But, when I go to tell him about what a nerd he is, because he has the radio up like that and all that sort of thing, I feel perfectly free in letting him know what a nerd he is about that kind of thing. However, when he turns to me and says, you really aggravate me, every time I leave the room you ask me a question, so I'm out in the hallway wondering what you're mumbling. You never tell me when I'm standing here looking at you. You always talk to me as I'm walking out the door. What's with you? I always think, what a jerk, what a jerk, what a jerk. What a picky jerk. But I feel very free to talk to him about what a nerd he is. See, it's like the only thing that helps me not do that, which makes me very difficult to deal with when I can't. The only thing that helps me is that sense of shame I have on board. That tells me I'm fallible and that I impact people adversely according to how they process the reality of who I am. There's no right or wrong or good or bad to that. There's just who I am as I'm spinning around in my environment, for example, affecting Pat. Now, it's the shame that I've learned to feel and embrace that allows me to listen to Pat and understand that I am impacting him adversely. Most people in their disease only pay attention to how others are impacting them adversely and don't pay attention to how they're out in the environment affecting others. It's our shame that puts us on alert to how we're impacting others adversely. In other words, especially with people you live with, they're the ones that point out all your imperfection, don't they? Like me talking to him as he's walked out the door. Or putting his coffee cup away before he's done drinking because I like things neat. Or all those other things I do, like putting his stools away. We have this long battle going on. We have built 2 extra rooms on our house to settle the fight, and I don't think it's going to work. My husband likes to create these piles so he can find things. What he does is he puts everything in these piles all over the house. Anybody's been to our house have seen these piles. It's embarrassing to me. Finally, I stopped having anybody over because I didn't want them to see them. I was taught in my family of origin, and my sister here will tell you this is true, that you put everything away, and when you don't, you're a pig. They used to call us pigs because we didn't clean our rooms properly. Anyway, so I put things away to find it. He puts them in piles to find it, and we conflict. Now, who's right or who's wrong? Who's good or bad? Who's blah, 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 blah? Neither one. His system is just as neat as mine, isn't it? I think that's creative to make piles, don't you, to find things? That's true. That is very creative. Most people will identify my husband as a creative man. On the other hand, isn't it creative to put it away so you can find it? See, it's neither right or wrong or good or bad, but it's each of us being able to experience our own shame that allows us to be able to hear how we impact others adversely. So shame, one of the great gifts it gives us is that it teaches us or allows us to be accountable for who we are, know our poop smells so that we can not only be accountable, we have then the ability to invite a higher power into our life to help us out because we're not the higher power. Okay? So shame brings us spirituality and accountability. There's another thing that I want to mention, and that's about around shame and spirituality, and that's about how I discovered my own sense of spirituality. Let me define spirituality for you so you have some understanding what I'm talking about. I think spirituality is about a moment of being in a relationship with a power greater than self and greater than your parents. That when you are experiencing the relationship is bringing you guidance, solace, and or serenity. I certainly had trouble being a spiritual person prior to recovery. Couldn't do it at all and hated anybody to talk about God. And I discovered it in 12-step meetings I attended because 2 things are going on in those meetings. If you ever paid attention to what's going on and everybody follows that no crosstalk rule, is you'll find that everybody is there blabbing away, no matter what meeting you go to, blabbing away about their issues of imperfection, and people are listening without interfering with what they're saying, without judging them and putting them down. Everybody keeps their mouth shut. Half the time, everybody is laughing or crying about what they're talking about, as they let out their own imperfection, everybody feels better because it's a leveler. Everybody is knowing that everybody kind of does their disease the same way, and so everybody feels good. And what they do is, because that's the attitude, share your imperfection. What it does is gives everybody an invitation to put it out there, put their imperfection out there, and they know they won't be judged. Then what comes back to is information about how people went beyond their imperfection and grew up. So in that process of an open invitation to put out who you are, as a result of that, you get gifts back that help you grow up, but as you get the gifts back too, you make connection with others. As you share, you make connections with others. That's why spirituality, I think, is about relationship. It's about being connected and sharing and receiving from others. That's how it started for me in those meetings. Eventually, because I was following the 12 steps, which are all spiritual in nature, I developed a relationship with a power greater than myself because I followed the rules around those steps. But before I could do any of that, I had to come to terms with my own shame and be willing to feel it. It enabled me to put out there into the environment who I was and be okay with that and all my perfect imperfection. It's probably one of the reasons why I have a lot of people kind of enjoy listening to my tapes. The steady feedback I get is, Pia, you sure put out there who you are and all your imperfection, don't you? And I said, sure. And the reason why I can do that is because I can feel my own shame. And I don't care if you see that my poop smells. I pay attention to one thing, and that's the level it is smelling. When it smells real bad, I will tell you I don't tell you about it. I admit it to the person who is really smelling it, and I make amends for having done that to him, whatever it is. In terms of shame then, and how it allows you to be accountable, what you have to pay attention to is how much shame you're feeling. If you're feeling very intense shame, what are you going to know? You're going to know you've done something kind of crappy to somebody else, aren't you? And it's affecting them adversely. What do you know to do? You know you can stop the behavior and make amends. That's the gift of shame. And it's a very, very important emotion. Again, when it's your own, you got to pay attention to whether it's shame or guilt. Guilt's a gnawing sense in your gut. It comes about when you break your own rules. Shame, however, is a sense of embarrassment that comes about when somebody else is noticing how imperfect you are. In other words, when you make mistakes and others are knowing about it, you feel shame. Sometimes when you've broken your own rules and people know about it, you feel shame as well as guilt. But guilt can be felt all by yourself. Your own shame is only experienced when somebody else is looking at you making a mistake. So shame is an emotion, and that's it. It's no more important, really, than that. And it comes about when your brain is telling you you've made a mistake. Now let me move on and talk about how this issue of shame is bound to the disease of codependence. It actually has to do with what happens in child abuse and how our feelings. And it has to do also, again, with feelings. And it's about the second half of the title of this particular series. Remember I told you shame, a gift from God? The reason why I say shame is a gift from God is because it allows you to be a spiritual person and allows you to be accountable. But the second half of that title is shame, legacy of abuse. This is about how it's the legacy of abuse. See, shame is positive and negative. When it's your own, it's positive. When it is not your own and is somebody else's, it becomes negative. That's the issue and becomes a legacy of abuse. It happens because of what we call carried or induced feeling reality. The principle around that is this, that whenever we as a human being are around another person who refuses to feel their feelings or who is outrageous with their own feelings. In other words, when we are around another human being and they're not dealing with their emotions properly, what happens as they refuse to embrace their feelings is they radiate them out very, very intensely. If we as codependents are around people doing that and have failed to develop our internal boundary, when we get near those people, we have a tendency to take that emotion on from them, add it to our own, and go on overwhelm. Now, that particular dynamic sets up problems with our feeling reality. Codependents, by and large, feel their feelings 4 different ways. They don't feel feelings normally. They don't feel feelings just from as they think they create their feelings. They feel feelings 4 different ways, which complicates the disease. But the reason why they feel 2 of these feelings is because of that principle. That when a human being without good internal boundaries is around another who's in denial of or being irresponsible with their feeling reality, the person has a tendency to take that feeling reality on because they're so intensely radiated from others. Now let me move on and talk about how this issue of shame is bound to the disease of codependence. It actually has to do with what happens in child abuse and how our feelings, and it has to do also again with feelings. And it's about the second half of the title of this particular series. Remember I told you shame, a gift from God? The reason why I say shame is a gift from God is because it allows you to be a spiritual person and allows you to be accountable. But the second half of that title is shame, legacy of abuse. This is about how it's the legacy of abuse. See, shame is positive and negative. When it's your own, it's positive. When it is not your own and is somebody else's, it becomes negative. That's the issue and becomes a legacy of abuse. It happens because of what we call carried or induced feeling reality. The principle around that is this, that whenever we as a human being are around another person who refuses to feel their feelings or who is outrageous with their own feelings, in other words, when we are around another human being and they're not dealing with their emotions properly, what happens as they refuse to embrace their feelings is they radiate them out very, very intensely. If we as codependents are around people doing that and have failed to develop our internal boundary, when we get near those people, we have a tendency to take that emotion on from them, add it to our own, and go on overwhelm. Now, that particular dynamic sets up problems with our feeling reality. Codependents, by and large, feel their feelings 4 different ways. They don't feel feelings normally. They don't feel feelings just from as they think they create their feelings. They feel feelings 4 different ways, which complicates the disease. But the reason why they feel 2 of these feelings is because of that principle. That when a human being without good internal boundaries is around another who's in denial of or being irresponsible with their feeling reality, the person has a tendency to take that feeling reality on because they're so intensely radiated from others. Now let's go back to codependence being caused by child abuse. What we know in abusive homes is that whenever a major caregiver is irresponsible with or in denial of his or her own feelings, the feelings being denied or handled irresponsibly will be picked up and carried by children in the vicinity. That's what beats us to death in our family of origin. See, we as little children, because we lack the ability to set functional boundaries with others, because kids can't do it, when they're around adults who are being irresponsible with or in denial of their feelings, they take on that feeling reality that's radiated from their parents, and they take it on as their own because they don't have an internal boundary that'll push that emotion back, that'll block that emotion so they don't take it on. Kids in dysfunctional systems are being barraged by the feeling reality their parents don't want to feel. And what do we know about this culture? This culture is rampant with addiction issues. Addiction issues are about avoiding reality, principally feeling reality. Kids are subjected to parents all the time, medicating their reality through the use of addictions. And as they're medicating that reality, they are radiating the feelings they're medicating intensely. And kids are like little sponges, and they pick up on that feeling, take it on board, and get overwhelmed. There are all kinds of ways they get overwhelmed. The principal way they get overwhelmed is that, well, what do you think that might be? Where do your emotions come from? Your emotions come from you're thinking as you think you feel. What if your feelings come off of somebody else? What does that make your brain do? Huh? No, it doesn't make your brain shut down. It makes it do something else. Well, you can shut it down. But prior to shutting it down, what's going on in your brain? When you've taken on emotions from somebody else and they don't fit your brain, what's your brain going to start doing? First thing it'll tell you is that you're confused. Go on alert about that. Whenever you're around somebody and you're going, I'm confused, or your brain is telling you, I'm crazy, you're probably picking emotions off of somebody else. That's the first thing I pay attention to. If I'm sitting in a room around somebody that looks kind of normal and I start feeling crazy, or I start getting confused by what they're saying, what's usually going on is they're having all these emotions going on and they're pretending like they're not happening, they're denying they're not happening. And I'm picking them up. My brain always goes, confusion. If I've really taken too much on, I just begin to feel wacky and crazy. Today, I've taught myself to pay attention to that. Whenever I'm around somebody, my brain's going, this is not making sense. Something's crazy here. I don't understand what they're saying. And furthermore, I have all these feelings going on. They don't connect with anything here. What I know right now is to get out of the room with whoever I'm with and sit down and get centered again and take a look at what's going on with them, because I have generally taken on that emotion. Now, how much work do you think it's taken for me to learn how to do that? Do you think children can do that? Of course they can't. They don't know what's going on. They are vulnerable little people. They don't have boundaries. They walk around in all that crazy environment and take all that garbage on from their parents. I know my sister and I did. We had board-certified do-funny parents. They never did anything appropriate. We were talking on the phone last night about that. I noticed that the more I talked, the louder I got. Pretty soon I was just yelling on the telephone, just so angry with my parents. Even today sometimes, if I wallow in it. I haven't talked to them for years, so I don't think about it very often. But whenever I get back into it and think about what it was like growing up with those two nuts, I get angry. Because you know what? It was brutal. You can ask who my sister and I have been married to tell you about that. The effects that those two people had on us, especially in terms of our feeling reality, have been profound. We could not defend ourselves from all those emotions our parents were not feeling or were being irresponsible with. We took them on, and generally speaking, we walked around on a 24-hour basis feeling crazier than snot. And guess who wound up seeing the doctor about it? We did. We were the ones that were identified as nuts. We got to go to the doctor. I want you to know it was a case of mistaken identity. Guess who belonged at the doctor's office? Our mother. She's a schizoid personality drug addict. She belonged to the doctor. The two of us went instead. My sister got physically ill and I got crazy. And we wound up in the doctor's office. And I'll tell you what, it's our mother that belonged there. In addition to that, our father needed help too because he was a major offender. Neither one owned their own feeling reality. We walked around in that house feeling crazy. That's why I never go back. I don't even talk to them. She talks to them. I don't talk to them. I can't stand them. Because they still do it. Go around. My father denies his own shame. He is a shameless person. If you ever want to find an offender, well, I can't tell you who he is. You won't ever find out who he is if you know who I am, because my name does not reflect who he is. But I will tell you something. If I ever wanted to teach you what it feels like to be around a shameless offender, all you have to do is spend 5 minutes with that guy. Because he's shameless and you can feel it. Everybody just has a drop and a sense of worth just being around him, because whenever he is being shameless or being offensive, everybody else feels his own shame and drops down with their sense of worth, and it feels terrible. Just terribly says terrible things. Like I remember one time sitting in my living room when he made some comment about his present wife being fat. Talked about her fat butt in front of her, and everybody else made some comment like that. I had a shame attack, which is something else, but anyway, I had this drop of sense of worth. She got silent, my husband got silent, we all got silent, my father just sat there and smiled. All of us felt terrible. You know what we needed to do at that moment? Tell him to sit down and shut up, and to not talk like that. See, when you're around a shameless person, what it does is it makes you feel worthless, and it silences your mouth. What happens to people when they're around offenders is they go silent, and the offender gets away with it. Because we drop in that sense of value. I've gotten off on my dad. Let me go back. Walter probably have to. Nancy, you should not have called me last night. I started thinking about him and getting angrier all day today. What happens to kids is when they're around parents who are angry and denying their anger, the kids have a tendency to rage. When they're around their parents who are feeling pain and the pain is denied or not dealt with, they have a tendency to feel hopeless and suicidal, the children. When kids are around parents who are being irresponsible with their own issues of fear, the kids have a tendency to feel panicked and paranoid. But the major thing I'm talking about tonight is shame and what it feels like for children to be around a parent who's being shameless. And that's any parent who's denying their own shame. When a child takes on shame from an adult who is being shameless, the child adds that shame to their own sense of shame, and there's a drop in the sense of value. Your own shame will never drop your value. You know you are always in feeling shame from somebody else whenever you are feeling worthless or there's a sense of drop in your own value. Now that's very, very, very important to remember. And this, basically, I've been talking about it, and it goes like this. Your own shame only feels like embarrassment, and you don't have that drop in worth. But when you've taken shame on from somebody else because they've been shameless around you, you have a drop in that sense of value, which makes it impossible to heal from that first symptom of self-esteem if you have a lot of carried shame on board. It makes it impossible to experience appropriate levels of self-esteem when you have a lot of carried shame on board that's constantly telling you are worth less than others in terms of value. Now, I want to bring up another issue here. It's kind of a tangential issue, but it's about feelings, which are part of your reality. There's a lot of healing that has to go on with feelings in this issue of carried feelings and everything else. In terms of recovering from codependence and healing your feelings, you not only have to go through that experience of learning how to feel your own feelings and use them to help you, you also have to do something about this other dynamic, and that is that codependents don't just feel their own feelings. They feel other people's feelings, and they also have haunting, old, historical feeling reality out of their childhood they also have to deal with. In recovery, we learn how to experience only our adult feeling reality. And we learn how to discharge these other three I have up here on the chart. Codependents feel feelings in 4 ways. As they think they feel, and that's called adult feeling reality. They also feel reality when their internal boundaries are not intact. They feel feelings from others. You know, today in our environment, if we don't have good internal boundaries and we're around somebody who denies their feeling reality or is irresponsible, we will take those feelings on also from them. I call that adult to adult induced feeling reality. Now, part of this dynamic is normal. It's called empathy. Being able to pick up on other people's feeling reality as we're around them and they're having them, take it on and have appreciation for where they are in their own reality is called being empathic. But codependents go far beyond empathy. They take it on, pass through empathy, and go on into overwhelm and get crazy. In recovery, we learn to develop an internal boundary to block feeling reality other people are having. You see, because you can take too much on from somebody just feeling powerfully. And you have to learn and train yourself to not take on feeling reality off of somebody who is denying their feelings or being irresponsible with them. That's part of recovery. Having a boundary that bounces feeling reality back after you've only taken enough on to be empathic. Now, what are you going to do when you live with somebody who doesn't do their feelings? You get to do them for them until you develop an internal boundary. So in recovery, we're supposed to stay at 1 and just do number 2, adult to adult induced feeling reality, only to the point of empathy, and then we stop it. I do this all the time with people. I feel empathic, and then I start imaging a boundary out there to bounce everything off so I don't take too much on so I get wacky. Because in therapy, when you're dealing with people therapeutically, do you think you guys just feel a little bit in group? No, you guys get into a lot of intense emotions, so do I when I'm in therapy. As a therapist, if I don't learn how to bounce back some of that feeling reality so I'm just empathic, but I don't take so much on that I'm lying on the floor at the end of a session exhausted for feeling your feelings for you, I don't know how to do that. I get sick. I burn out. The third feeling reality that codependents feel is child feeling reality. This is historical old feeling reality. This is a feeling reality as kids that we had that we couldn't express as children because it wasn't safe to let it out. That stuff goes into our bodies and is held there until something releases it, usually from our brain. What happens to us in recovery is that, or just in our disease, what happens to us is the environment triggers this feeling reality to surface because something in our environment reminds us of how we've been abused, and then we get to feel that third feeling reality, all that old child feeling reality that we didn't get to express when we were little. That stuff comes up on us. Now this is important to pay attention to, because whenever we get into that feeling reality as triggered by our environment, we go into a child ego state. What did I tell you about codependence in the first place? Codependence is about being an immature person. What do you think is going to happen to you when you have an overwhelming sense of that old feeling reality brought about by something in your environment? You go into a child ego state. What do you think you're going to act like when you're in a child ego state? Or have you noticed that? When you're feeling that child feeling reality, what do you generally do? Do you think you act like an adult? No, I get it all the time. I've only learned how to control it. I always know I'm doing number 3 because what my brain tells me is that whereas with number 2, I feel kind of overwhelmed or crazy or kind of confused. With number 3, when I feel that, I start to feel like a little person. And my voice goes way up high. I notice that I start squeaking and whining. That's how I always know I'm doing that feeling. The whining starts, and I start to feel like I'm 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old, something like that. The fourth kind of feeling reality that codependents feel is adult to child carried feeling reality. It's really the same thing as number 2, adult to adult induced, but this adult to child carried feeling reality is about feelings we picked up off our parents as they were abusing us and carry for those parents and had no way of releasing any more than we had any way of releasing that child feeling reality. When we were kids, we took on feeling reality that they weren't willing to deal with. That too gets triggered by our environment. Now, in terms of this lecture, because I'm lecturing about shame, when we have something happen in our environment that triggers number 4 in terms of carried shame, that's when we feel the worthless feeling. That's when we have that drop in value, that something is happening in our environment that triggers that old feeling reality that we took on board from our parents or our major caregivers as they were being shameless, and we took on their shame for them. Parents, I believe, are shameless whenever they abuse their kids, and I don't care whether it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, intellectual abuse, social abuse, or there's some others. I don't care what kind of abuse it is. If a parent is taking advantage of a child and abusing them, they are in a state of shamelessness. That's why when a child is being abused, they start feeling worthless. It's the message to the child during the time of abuse is that something's wrong with them. And that's how shame, again, is connected to the illness, because through our feeling reality, when we carry shame for others, it puts us into the sense of being worth less. It's only other people's shame that makes us feel worth less, especially the old shame carried from the major caregivers who abused us. Sometimes with this adult-to-adult induced feeling reality, when we're around another shameless adult, have you noticed that you don't necessarily feel worthless as they're being shameless, but you just feel embarrassed for them? Yeah. As an adult, we have some protection when we're around a shameless person because our brains will tell us that they're being shameless, and we can kind of know that and not have that drop in worth, but just feel embarrassed for them. However, during extreme abuse, when we're around a real shameless person, like getting raped, a rapist is a shameless offender. Victims of rape feel worthless because they're being treated like they're worthless, and also because the offender is being shameless. So depending upon the intensity of the offense when you're around a shameless person will affect whether you just feel embarrassed for them or have a drop in the sense of worth. But can you see how shame affects all those dynamics? That carried shame, it's carried shame or induced shame that makes a person feel worthless, not their own shame. And during any experience of child abuse, where the message from the parent to the child is that they are worthless, there is a drop in a sense of value, and it's the shame taken off the parent that makes the child start to feel worthless. Now, in terms of the disease, there's another interesting dynamic. And that has to do with another dynamic of child abuse, and that is this, that there's actually two kinds of child abuse in terms of the issue of shame. There is child abuse that makes the child feel worth less, and there's child abuse that makes the child feel better than. Did you notice that? As you inventoried your own issues of abuse, that sometimes the way your parents treated you made you feel worthless, and sometimes according to how they were treated you felt better than. The kind of abuse that makes a child feel worthless we call disempowering abuse. The kind of child abuse that makes a child feel better than is called false empowering abuse. They have different dynamics to them. Basically, when you experience disempowering abuse, it makes you feel worthless as a child. When you experience falsely empowering abuse as a child, you wind up feeling better than, which sets up the dynamic of the first core symptom, difficulty experiencing appropriate levels of self-esteem. Now, what I say when I'm teaching people to track this stuff is I tell them that the roots of their illness, the very roots of their illness, is about child abuse. The roots of their illness feed a generator of the illness, what I call a generator of the illness. Another way to talk about this generator of the illness is I call the generator their shame issues. In the disease of codependence, because of the empowering and disempowering abuse, you will see that codependents have two issues around shame. This I would tell you is very important. In the codependent, when you examine them, you will find the codependent has three dynamics in terms of these shame issues. They are a codependent who has too much of somebody else's shame. In other words, they carry around shame from another person that makes them feel worthless. On the other hand, in the disease too, you can see that oftentimes it's not that they have too much of somebody else's shame, they have too little of their own. Those are the shame issues in the disease. We experience too little of our own shame or too much of somebody else's, which sets up the shame dynamics in the illness of codependence. Why would we have too much shame from somebody else? Because we've picked it up and taken it on board and handled it like our own, which makes us feel worthless. On the other hand, we can experience too little of our own shame. And in that experience, we get set up to be shameless. When we get set up to be shameless, we have a tendency to be an offender. Are you following me so far? I can rattle this stuff off in my sleep, but I don't know how fast people can track it. When we feel too much of somebody else's shame, we're set up to be what? The opposite. A big victim, because we feel too worthless to defend ourselves. Here, because of lacking a sense of our own shame, we're set up to be offender because we don't know our poop smells. And something else can't happen that's very interesting. Shame not only allows us to be accountable for our adverse impact on others, it also causes us to put a limit on our own reality, because we know we'd had better be careful with it. We know we can be out of bounds with this, and it's our own sense of shame that causes us to put a limit on ourselves. When we have too little shame, we don't have enough to set limits on ourselves. That's what sets us up to be an offender. When we have too much of somebody else's, it causes us to feel worthless and fail to defend ourselves. But when we have too much of somebody else, when we don't have enough of our own, it sets us up to be out of control. How do you think? Well, let me not ask you questions about this. I'll just flail away at it. One of the things I noticed when I was trying to figure out these dynamics for myself was that when I thought about it, and I remember babies being born, because I am an RN and I've delivered a few of those against my will, but I did deliver a few of them. I noticed that babies at birth can feel pain, and they can feel joy, and they can feel fear, and they can feel anger readily. Soon after birth, they can feel all that stuff, and I'll let you know about it. But there's 2 emotions they don't feel. Well, actually 3. What are those 3? Shame, guilt, and lust. Have you ever seen a baby feel shame? No. They don't get embarrassed. Did you ever see one feel guilty? No, they don't feel guilt, and they also don't feel lust either. Those are emotions that are developed later on and take a certain amount of anatomy and physiology growth in order to even feel. How do you think a child learns to feel their own shame? How does that come about, do you think? How does a person become a person who has too little of their own shame? How do you think a child learns? How does that come about? Yeah, from their parents confronting. A child learns to feel their own shame as the parent respectfully confronts the child about their poop smelling. That's how a child learns to feel shame. Daniel, my son Daniel, is probably the best example of all. I've given this example before, but it's so common everybody can identify with it. Daniel doesn't like to eat in public with manners. He could care less about that. He eats with his hands. He eats fast, and he puts as much in his mouth as he can. Now, I really don't care if Daniel's by himself if he eats that way, but when we go to a Mexican restaurant, I really don't appreciate him stuffing a whole enchilada in his mouth in about 2 seconds. I sit there and gag. It bothers me. And I don't want him to do it because I want him to have manners. So what I do when we go to restaurants, and we always get into this, Daniel, you're in a restaurant now, let's eat with some manners. These are the family rules. As he is stuffing the whole enchilada in his mouth, I confront him. I say, Daniel, put it down on the plate. Cut it up in little pieces, put it 1 bite at a time in your mouth, chew it and swallow it. And guess what he does? I don't say that so anybody can hear me. I only say it so Daniel can hear, and he does this all the time. His face turns red, and he does this. And then pulls it all out of his mouth, puts it on his plate, and cuts it up. But that little pink thing behind his face is called his shame. And I do that as his parent. I confront his issues of his perfect imperfection. So does his sister. We all went on vacation about a month ago. And she got to deal with it too. It was really funny. It exhausted her as much as it did me, getting him to eat. I think we were in a power struggle, though. I think something else is going on with Daniel, and he was enjoying grossing us out. But anyway, that's a whole other issue. But when you confront your child's issues of perfect imperfection, you teach them to feel their own shame. If you had a parent that didn't correct you, guess what your problem is going to be? You're not going to have enough shame on board. That's what creates the shameless codependent. They don't have enough of their own. They can still have plenty, though, of somebody else's. In other words, they can have a shame core, a well house of carried feeling reality from the people who have offended, but in addition to that, have too little of their own. They can also have a well house of carried feeling reality and their own. And some of them, which is really confusing, can have a well house of carried feeling reality and none of their own, which makes people feel crazy. Part of recovery and part of assessing somebody around their shame issue has to do with figuring out how they were abused, how much of their own shame they experience, and how much carried shame they have on board. Can you see what I mean? But always when we look at the issue of shame and the codependent in their disease is that by and large the codependent will have too much of somebody else's or too little of their own or both. Too much of somebody else's sets them up to be a victim and feel worthless. Too little of their own sets them up to be offender and shameless, which creates different kinds of problems. Now, some codependents have another issue, and that is they experience a lot of disempowering abuse. On the other hand, they also experience a lot of empowering abuse where they are taught that they are better than other people. And another thing that goes along with this dynamic is not only are they taught that they are better than other people, they're also taught to be good and perfect, and so that they can judge others and feel better than. That's another dynamic in this illness. Some of us just flat out get told we're worthless. We never get empowered. We never get told that we're better than because we're black, white, Chicano, Christians, Catholics, Jews, or whatever we want to do that makes us feel better than. We never get that kind of palaver from anybody. We're just taught we're worthless. So we always ride in the one-down position. But those of us who are taught, ashamed, but also taught that we were better than because we were white or whatever, also have that dynamic of judging others who don't meet the mark that we meet, so we feel better than and look down on others, but we also feel worthless at the same time, and are busy being good and perfect so that we can judge others and feel better than, if we don't just flat out judge them and say we're better than because we're black, we're white, we're Catholic, or whatever we're doing to make ourselves feel better than. All that's about the illness. All that is about attempting to heal the wound of shame by judging others and feeling better than in that judgment. Perfectionism is also about this whole dynamic. Perfectionism is about being perfect so that when you're busy judging others, you can always feel better than because you did it better than. Not that you're perfect, though. It's only that you decided what was perfect, hit that mark, and then noticing everybody in your environment who's not doing that so you can feel better than. That's also part of this disease. Whenever you are engaging perfectionism or being judgmental, then you're in your first core symptom, difficulty experiencing appropriate levels of self-esteem. You're busy being better than. And I want to tell you something about that stuff. When you're judging other people, guess what they're going to know? They always know you're doing it. Don't think that when you're judging others, that they don't know you're doing it. Because when you're doing that, your face will be doing something really weird. Your face will do this. And they'll have a sense you're looking down your nose at them, and you are. Because you're being good and perfect, judging them so you can feel better than and heal that old shame wound, that wound that tells you you're worthless because your parents treated you like you were worthless. Do you see how this issue of shame keeps coming in and leaking in? It's not that complicated, though. It's about having too little of your own or too much of somebody else's. Having enough of your own is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful gift to you. Enables you to be accountable and still feel comfortable as you're accountable, knowing you're not worthless. You just know your poop smells, and sometimes it smells so bad you have to make amends and stop your behavior, period. That's just it. That's just what happens. Part of recovery. And you learn to get comfortable with that and not worry about it. When I make a mistake now, I don't care. I get into some wild experiences when I'm doing my work. I forget what I was supposed to be lecturing about. Sometimes I get way off on a tangent. I can't remember what I was lecturing about. I have to ask the audience, what was I talking about? Do you remember? I don't care. I really don't care. If it bothers people enough to the point where they don't come and listen to me, then I'll go do something else. It really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It only matters that I don't offend you, to me. It only matters that I don't break your boundaries, that I don't plunge through your boundaries and offend you in some way by being a boundary violator. Other than that, I really don't care if you see that my poop smells. As long as it's not one of those things that's really terrible. You know, so I don't tell you about that stuff. That's why I never talk about being a sex addict. I was supposed to give my story at an SLA thingamajig up in Cleveland the other day, you know, and I was relieved to find out because I got all screwed up. I hadn't asked Barbara what I was supposed to talk about, and I couldn't. I thought maybe I've got to talk about being a sex addict. All I really wanted to talk about is being a love addict, not a sex addict. And I got into this profound attack of panic, thinking I had to do that because, of course, that's when your poop really smells, isn't it? And I hate to be real public with that, but anyway. What I noticed, which makes it very hard to recover from the disease, is that in regards to the core symptoms, the core symptoms being self-esteem issues, boundary issues, reality issues, dependency issues around needs and wants. When we look at the first 4 primary or core symptoms of the disease of codependence, I have noticed that people have shame bound to each one of these core symptoms, which effectively keeps a person from getting into recovery from the symptoms of the illness. And that comes from being shamed as a child around these very issues. If a child has a lot of disempowering abuse and gets told that they are worthless, they will essentially wind up with what we call a shame self-esteem bind or a shame value bind. What that means is that when this person becomes an adult, and is working to experience their own sense of value, learning how to affirm themselves, learning how to go against the message that somehow they're worthless, what will happen is they will have a shame attack. A shame attack is a sudden, overwhelming sense of being a worthless person. Puts you in that one-down position. If a child has been shamed as a child for esteeming themselves, when they work on their self-esteem issues today, they will have a shame attack when they're in the midst of it and somebody else is noticing this is going on. In other words, if they have a shame self-esteem bind or a shame value bind, today, as they state to another person that they are a worthwhile human being, it'll be followed by a shame attack. How you know you have a shame bind is that whenever you experience the reality of wherever the bind is, you will have a shame attack. A shame attack means you have a shame bind. If you have a shame bind, it means you'll have a shame attack whenever you go to experience that. So today in recovery, as you're trying to esteem yourself and you're doing it in front of somebody else, you'll have a shame attack. This shame self-esteem bind can also have two kind of quirky looking experiences of what I would call a shame self-esteem bind, but it comes in the form of two other binds, but they're all related. One is a shame affirmation bind and the other is a shame existence bind. When a child lives in a family of origin that shames them for having been born, they will have a shame existence bind, which makes it really hard to want to be alive. They'll feel worthless about being alive. They'll be in a process of constantly trying to die. They will not think they're worth living. This is probably the very, very worst shame bind a person can have. It's set up by parents saying to children that they didn't want them. That when they were born, they destroyed somebody. Like people said, oh, you killed your mother when you were born, or you ruined her permanently. Having a mother say to a child that you destroyed my life by being born will set up a shame existence bind. It's the very worst shame bind around this issue of value because it takes away a person's right to be alive. You can also have a shame affirmation bind, which means you got shamed as a child for affirming yourself or esteeming yourself. And so today when you affirm yourself and somebody else is noticing that, you will have a shame attack. I used to get into this constantly. I'd get into a shame affirmation bind or a shame existence bind when I was doing my work. I go lecture to people. And I was always a reluctant warrior. I still don't even like doing this. I only do this because it seems to be what I'm supposed to be doing. But I really don't. I don't like to be up here with you all looking at me. What happens is that this is what used to happen, and now I'm kind of gotten over it. But what would happen is that you would come up and say, oh, you're just so neat and helpful to me. And then I'd have a massive shame attack. It would be awful. It's like I'd put it out there and then somebody would come up and say, oh, that was so helpful, and I'd have a massive shame attack. That's a shame affirmation bind. As you affirm me, I have a shame attack. And that used to make it real hard to get out and do my work because I couldn't stand it. Because it was so painful to have you affirm me. Now that's what a shame affirmation bind is. Or somebody come up and say, oh, Pia, I'm so glad you're alive. You have been so helpful to me. And I'd get into a shame existence bind and have a shame attack because you affirmed the fact that I was alive and helpful to you. Do you know how awful that was getting over that? Most lecturers in the field don't come from my position. Most people who work in the field and are speakers do not come from the kind of disempowering abuse that I had. Most of them are empowered codependents, falsely empowered codependents. Most speakers in the field come from a position of one up. I've come from the position of one down, which is why I have trouble doing it in the first place. Not that I have trouble talking. I don't have trouble talking. Just ask my husband. But I have trouble with you all looking at me and saying things to me that feel nice and affirming because I have these shame value binds, shame affirmation binds, and shame existence binds. Now, I've worked through that shame existence bind, and most of the time I'm not doing that. Every now and then it'll hit me, and I always know I'm in this bind with shame because my mind will start thinking about not wanting to live anymore, and that still happens to me. Sometimes it's just like a struggle, like I don't want to be doing this anymore. I just wish I could just stop breathing, kind of float off into oblivion. It's just a struggle to be doing this because deep inside myself, nobody affirmed Nobody taught me to affirm my right to exist, and I have a hard time with that process of affirmation within myself that I have a right to exist, I have a right to breathe, I have a right to take up space, I have a right to use stuff out of my environment. It's deeper than the shame affirmation bind. The shame existence bind is the very worst wound of all. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? I don't want to beat this subject to death, but it's a horrible thing. This is probably the worst one again of all. The shame existence bind. If you don't have that one, you have a shame affirmation bind. If you don't have that one, you have a shame value bind. Another bind that we see with the disease is that people have shame boundary binds. This means whenever they go to set a boundary with another person, they will have a shame attack. Always remember, shame attack, shame bind mean the same thing. As they go to set an external boundary with someone and set a limit on somebody's body coming after them, they have a massive shame attack. Or if somebody says to them, hey, your body is to stop and not touch me, you have a shame attack because somebody's setting a boundary with you. Either way, coming and going. If somebody shamed you as a child for attempting to set a physical boundary with them or a sexual boundary, today when you go into that experience, you'll have a massive shame attack. An example of how a shame boundary bind can be set up is in a family system where somebody's out of control as an adult, abusing a child physically or sexually. The child crabs about it, complains about it, says, I don't want to kiss Aunt Harriet. But Aunt Harriet keeps coming to the house and planting these big wet kisses on this kid's face, and the mother goes, shame on you, how can you say that about poor Aunt Harriet? You stand there and you let her do that to you. That'll set up a shame physical boundary or possibly a shame sexual boundary bind with that child later on as an adult. So when he as an adult tries to set a physical limit on a female or a sexual limit on a female, that person will have a shame attack in attempting to set a boundary. You can have shame bound to your external boundary, shame bound to your external physical boundaries, shame bound to your external sexual boundary, or shame bound to your internal boundary. Your internal boundary is another way to set limits on people. And it's the boundary that tells you you create your reality and others create theirs. And whenever you're about stating that out into the environment, you're listening to somebody's incoming reality, knowing that they've created it, knowing that you create your own, not taking ownership for what somebody else has created, and you verbalize that, you'll have a shame attack. That's the shame internal boundary bind. You can also have shame bound to any part of your reality. If you were shamed as a child for having that reality, somebody shamed you about your body and told you were ugly, had big ears, flat feet, pimples, and shamed you about that experience of your body, you have a shame body bind. Sexual abuse victims, incest survivors of molestation have shame body binds. That's why they often develop a wall of fat to cover it up so you can't tell what it is. So you can't see their body. That's to avoid the shame. They start losing weight. Guess what they get into? Massive shame attacks about their body. They don't want it touched. They don't want it looked at. They have terrible problems. When they arrest their eating disorder, they go into this massive other problems around a shame body bind. They can have a shame thinking bind. If they got shame for their thinking as children, then today they will have a shame attack whenever they verbalize a thought to another human being and they're in the awareness of the other person being haven't heard that, they'll have a shame attack. They can have a shame feeling bind. They can have a shame bound to pain. They can have a shame pain bind, a shame fear bind, a shame anger bind, a shame joy bind. Anybody in here have a shame joy bind? That means whenever you're happy, you'll have a shame attack. Anybody do that? They get happy and then they feel worthless because they're happy? That's a shame joy bind. Get in pain and then feel worthless because somebody else is in the knowing of them having pain, in the knowing of them having joy, seeing that they're angry, seeing that they're afraid. Those are all shame binds with feeling reality. Or you can have shame bound to your behavior. That means when anybody's observing your behavior, no matter what it is, you'll have a shame attack. Like you can just be doing something very simple and somebody walks up and makes a comment about it and you have a shame attack. I used to have that bind too, which made it very hard to lecture. Because whenever you were noticing anything about me, half the time I was in a massive shame attack as I was trying to talk. It was terrible. It was a lot of work to talk publicly. You can have shame bound to your needs. If as a child you were shamed for any one of these needs, food needs, clothing needs, shelter needs, physical nurturing needs. Physical nurturing is about getting hugging and things like that. Emotional nurturing. If you got shame for requesting emotional nurturing, in other words, if you had gone to your parent and asked for time, attention, or direction from them and they shamed you for asking for that kind of help, you can have a shame emotional nurturing bind, a shame medical bind. That means whenever you need to go to the doctor, You don't go because when you do, you have a massive shame attack about that kind of self-care. A shame dental bind, a shame sexual bind. You're shame bound to the experience of being sexual because somebody shamed you about your sexual issues. You can have a shame financial bind. My financial planner is actually in the audience. I had a massive, she's sitting over there. She's a wonderful lady. She's in that turquoise shirt over there in the front row. Bony finger her and let her have a shame attack. She's also a therapist, interestingly enough. Thank God I found something like that. By accident, I got referred to her for my shame financial bind. What was going on with me is I had shame around issues of money. And what would happen is whenever I tried to face the issues around handling some money I have a massive shame attack and get immobilized and do nothing about it. In order to overcome this, I had to go to Marion and have her teach me how to handle money and force myself, despite all these shame attacks, to go to her office and talk to her about it anyway. Going to her office, first of all, it took, you can ask my administrative assistant there, Barbara, sitting in the second row right there. It took me 6 months to make myself go see Marion. It was awful. It was worse than going to the dentist. You know how you resist going to the dentist, put it off for a year or so until you really have problems? I put that off for 6 months knowing I had to do that as part of my issues of recovery, going and breaking that bind with money. Finally, I went, and then it took me, I don't know how long before. I think it took us a year. Not because she was not doing something, but because I was dragging my feet about paying attention to it and learning what I was doing. I just went to her office a few days ago. I got all these financial statements back, and I couldn't read them. My brain just went on blank. It's like I knew she had told me about all this stuff. Had to make an appointment, go into her office, say, Marion, I can't think what this all means. Could you go over it? What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? What is that? My brain kept going. She'd tell me, I go, oh yeah, you've told me that before. She'd go, Trying to make myself understand finances and money and be responsible for it. Part of that was my having the right to have abundance, to embrace it, to work with it, to use it, to make it work for me, to have it in the first place. Kids can get shamed around their issues around money and their right to abundance and get into shame financial binds then in their disease. It means whenever they have to deal with it, they have a shame attack. Now what all this means, you can also have shame bound to your issues of wants. Wants are preferences. They're what bring joy to your life. They're wonderful experiences. They don't have very much to do with your needs at all. It just has to do with what brings you joy. You can have shame bound to your wants. Now, why I bring this up is because wherever you have shame bound to any one of these first core symptoms, until you break the shame bind, you will not recover from that symptom. That's how important it is to understand this issue of carried shame, shame binds, shame attacks. Shame binds are set up in childhood when a child gets shamed for any one of these experiences. Shame for self-valuing, shame for setting boundaries, shame for any part of their reality, shame for their needs, or shame for their wants. Shame binds are set up, which means whenever today as an adult they try to work through their illnesses, as they're doing that, they have massive shame attacks around each one of these issues. What happens when you have a shame attack and sink into that pit of worthlessness? What happens to you when that happens? What does your behavior look like? Two things I know. You go silent and your brain shuts down, don't you? Now, how can you work against a symptom if you're standing there? I can't tell you how many times somebody come up and they touch me and I didn't know them. And I know that I had to say to this person, please don't touch me. I don't know you well enough for you to be touching me. Well, what would I do if I said that to that person? What would I be in an act of doing? Setting a physical boundary with another human being. What I'd do is I'd stand there and I'd be knowing I had to do it, but the minute I opened my mouth, made public my need for a boundary with this person, as soon as it flew out of my mouth, I'd have a massive shame attack. Now what would happen is I knew that was going to happen if I opened my mouth, so what did it do? It silenced me, and I'd stand there letting this person touch me when I didn't want him touching me. And what would I be in? My disease. And I'd stay there until I finally would get into so much pain about not protecting myself, because I was aware that I needed to learn to set boundaries, that I'd turn and I'd say, please don't touch me. I don't know you well enough to touch me. I'd go push myself through the shame attack and up and out of it and then go on. That's the work of recovery. Most of the work of recovery around the primary symptoms are about breaking up those spines and teaching yourself how to experience each one of these issues normally. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about this issue of shame binds, shame attacks, and how it immobilizes you within your own disease? You all understanding that? It's critical to understand that. You have shame bonds wherever you carry shame for somebody else who abused you around these issues. That's the issue of too much carried shame from another human being. Too much of somebody else's shame. But what about the person who has too little of their own? How does that affect these symptoms? Well, it looks like this, if I can find my glasses. I don't have these problems as much as I have those others, so I have to kind of really think about it. Sometimes I wish I did, though. These people are more comfortable because they don't know their poop smells. They don't know how they bother other people. It never occurs to them, so they're not in very much pain. Have you ever noticed that about these people who have too little of their own shame? Have you ever noticed that? No. Okay, a person who lacks shame around their sense of value is a person who basically what it means is they don't have enough shame to set limits on their own self-valuing, so that they're constantly giving themselves permission to feel better than, judge others and look down upon others as somehow worth less than they are. When they lack too little shame, they don't have an ability to set limits on their reality. You know, it's the shame that sets limits on a person's reality. So they're about offending other people's boundary because they lack the shame to let them know how they're impacting other people with their own reality. They're boundaryless. They also don't have enough shame to sensitize themselves to the reality of how their reality is being handled by the environment, so they can't put limits on their own reality and can't see the effect of their reality on others. And they can't see that they need to put limits on their own issues of needs and wants. And they're about getting all their needs and all their wants taken care of at the expense of other people. They take from others. And again, when you see this lacking enough of their own shame, basically what it means around these symptoms is they can't put any limits here. And they're about taking value from others, punching through other people's boundaries without seeing the effect. Unable to see the effect of their reality on others. Again, these two are tied together. Boundaries and reality are tied together. And unable to set limits on their own issues of needing and wanting. And they literally take from others. This is the disease in the other extreme. One is too little of their own shame. The other experience is too much of somebody else's, and it sets up the disease. It's really rather profound. Now, I want to go into the third phase of this lecture and that's on shame and relationship issues. And how shame affects us in our relationships with others. We basically learn how to be in relationships with other people. We learn how to do that in our original experience with our major caregivers, usually our parents. Our parents teach us two things about being in relationships with others. They teach us who we are and what to expect from others, both of which affect how we do relationships. When we come from dysfunctional parents, and basically when you look at dysfunctional systems or dysfunctional parents, what you're looking at is two addict codependents busy trying to have a relationship with each other, which is highly addicted and certainly not conducive to helping kids grow up. What happens with the codependent is that we are taught two things about who we are. Usually we ride in one position or the other. We are taught that we are better than others, or we are taught that we are worth less than other people. That's what we're taught. That same issue coming up again. The second thing that we are taught in these dysfunctional systems is what to expect from others. Basically, how that pans out as I see it is that we are taught to expect others to abandon us, or on the other hand, we are taught to expect others to drain us dry and use us. abandon us, not be there for us, or use us. We generally are taught in these dysfunctional systems one extreme or the other, which is really crazy making. Generally speaking, people that are in the experience of profoundly being used and drained by their parents are also taught to be better than. And people that are abandoned by their parents, not connected with their parents, are taught that they're worthless. You see those two dynamics going like that. So what happens to people is when they enter relationships with others, they're entering it from a position of disorder. They enter it expecting their mate to abandon them or their mate to engulf them. They enter it from a position of feeling worthless or a position of feeling better than. All four of those issues will prevent relationships from working. And they get taught this in their family of origin. Because of the shaming that goes on in dysfunctional families, if a child is shamed and taught to feel worthless, that person will enter a relationship feeling defective. If, on the other hand, the person receives a lot of empowering abuse, they will enter the relationship from the better than experience, and both will hamper how they deal with people they're trying to be in relationship with. In functional families, what we see is that both parents are filled with enough worth, they're in touch with their perfect imperfection, and they teach their children that everyone has equal value and everyone is equally fallible. So that people coming from functional systems do not enter relationships feeling one down or feeling one up. They enter relationships feeling equal, and they have the ability to love themselves and love another human being. Love being defined as holding somebody in warm personal regard and being concerned about what happens to that other person. In functional systems too, kids are taught to be responsible for their own issues of self-care. And they get taught in a functional system to expect others to be supportive, but not at the other's expense. They are taught to take responsibility for their own issues of self-care, taught that others will support them in that, but it isn't the other person's responsibility. So in functional systems, they produce people that enter relationships with a sense of worth and a sense of being responsible for their own issues of self-care. Not so when you've been raised in a dysfunctional system, as I said before. What happens to us is that we enter relationships with skewed dynamics going on. And what these dynamics produce for us are what I call power struggles, which brings up another interesting dynamic, and around shame too. And that's one thing I noticed too, is that there are three bedfellows that most people don't recognize are interrelated. They're value, power, and abundance. This is something else to recognize, especially as you try to be in a relationship with somebody else. Marion and I were talking about this the other day, because she handles money, and guess what money does for people? Huh? Let me show you how this works. It's very interesting. Now, for money, I'm gonna talk about money as being abundance. There's other things you can have in abundance, but essentially what we're talking about in this culture is money. What I will tell you is that as a person values themselves, they also increase their sense of power. As you devalue yourself, you disempower yourself. As you value yourself and treat yourself as though you are worthwhile, you automatically raise your sense of power. Have you noticed that? I noticed this very dramatically in my life. Probably it's because I've come from that disempowering position. I have noticed that as I learn to see myself more and more as a valuable person, I won't put up with abuse. It makes me angry when somebody abuses me now, whereas before I didn't even notice it or really care about it. Now, when somebody treats me as though I'm worthless, guess what comes up for me? Anger, because they are treating me as though I'm worthless. What does the emotion anger give you? What's the gift? Yeah. Anger brings you a sense of power. And as you value yourself, what will happen is if somebody treats you as worthless, your anger will rise and automatically your sense of power will rise. Now the third dynamic here is this issue of abundance. One of the things I noticed that as I worked on feeling like a worthwhile person and learned how to be angry when people were abusive to me, I empowered myself, and the more I did both of these, the more abundance I began to experience. You cannot expect to have abundance in your life if you're constantly devaluing yourself and failing to own your own power. These three go together. Another interesting dynamic when you watch people is that many people who are codependent try to heal the wound of being worthless by gathering money. Because everybody knows that, don't we? What do we do in this culture? We look at wealthy people somehow as being more worthwhile than a poor person. How many people get into that? Yeah, it's like if somebody has money, they're more valuable. That's a lot of hooey, you know. Just because somebody has money does not increase their sense of value, but we do that. And because that happens in our culture, what some people do to try to heal the wound of their own worthlessness is get a whole bunch of money. One of the interesting dynamics that goes on with that, however, is that as the person gets money, they don't value the money. The money means nothing to them, and they lose it easily and get it easily, and lose it easily and get it easily, because they can't hang on to it, because they don't value themselves enough to value their own money. But they're about getting that to try to heal this initial sense of worthlessness that has come about by being shamed originally in their family of origin. Another people try to heal this value wound by getting powerful. Did you ever notice that? That a lot of people don't go after money, they go after being powerful. How do they principally do that? If they're not going after the money, where do they seek the power? Where? Teaching? Well, yeah, they can teach and they can have power over their students, can't they? Overachieving. Overachieving is generally about trying to get the abundance to bring you the power, to bring you the value. Where people really get into these issues around power is basically in personal relationships. Yes, it's who's going to have the power, and what do they struggle over? What's the big fight over? The struggle is usually around whose reality is going to prevail. This is crazy. It's all about, in a very crooked way, trying to heal the dynamics that you can't heal that way. You can't heal shame issues by struggling by getting money. You can't heal the shame issues by struggling for power. The only way you can heal the shame issues is by learning how to value yourself and work through the shame. That's the only way you can heal the shame. You can't heal it by getting a bunch of power, and you can't heal it by getting a bunch of abundance. It won't work. You can see this happening all the time, not working. People struggle in their relationships really, how can I explain this so it's understandable? They struggle for power in order to control reality so that they can feel safe. In other words, what people get into is they have their reality, and the reality conflicts with their partner, so they fight about whose reality is going to prevail. They get in a power struggle or an issue for control, and whoever wins, in other words, whoever gets to be right, or whoever's reality prevail, that person feels safe. That person feels like they have the value and like they're a winner because they got to have it. And also something else happens is they get to have the reality and prevail and be right. Their sense of value goes up so they can feel okay about themselves. Most of these power struggles aren't really power struggles as much as they are struggles for value. Because the person cannot do the work of inherently valuing themselves within. They try to get their partner to value them by letting them win in situations and have their reality prevail. This is screwy. It's just totally screwy. You know, functional people don't do that. They don't have to do that. They don't even want to do it. Because nobody wins, do they? Have you ever noticed that in a relationship, nobody wins? What happens to the person who loses? What happens to the person that loses the power struggle? They do a little thing called getting even. You've ever noticed that? Whenever you lose, you always sneak around the bushes and get even? It's kind of like your partner notices somewhere down the line that there's blood dripping on their feet, their own. And they can't figure out how you did it, but that other person who lost that fight last week got even this week by doing something sneaky. If they can't win in the relationship, they go around the bushes and win in a real sneaky way so that the other person doesn't win. If there's a winner, there's always a loser. If there's a loser, there's two losers. Nobody wins. What has to happen in relationships is that the people who are struggling for the power and control and reality to prevail, that whole issue, they have to stop the power struggle, because that's not how you get the value. That's not how you get the value. That's not how you get safety. That's not how you win and are comfortable. What you have to do is work through your issues of shame so that you properly value yourself, and you have to work through your issues of self-care so that you don't have to rely totally on another person in order for you to be comfortable. Once you have healed those wounds of your primary symptoms of codependence, you no longer have to fight with your partners for the value and for your own sense of value, for your reality to prevail, and for your needs and wants to be taken care of. In recovery, we learn how to value ourselves from within. We need to look up at somebody or look down on somebody. We also learn how to own the nature of our reality, which helps us deal with our world. And we learn how to take care of our issues of needing and wanting. And so that when we go into relationships, we go into it from a position of healing, from a position of worth. We walk into a relationship loving ourselves. We walk into a relationship knowing who we are. We walk into a relationship knowing how to take care of ourselves. And when we can't take care of ourselves, we not only can ask our partners for help and support, but we can ask many other people, because we have many other people in our life who can do that for us, so we're in balance. So that we're not too needy as we enter relationships. We're not too wanting as we enter relationships. We're not too devoid of our own sense of reality. We're not devoid of our own sense of value, so we don't have to struggle with our partners to have them sacrifice those issues for themselves so we can have it from them. If you watch power struggles in relationships, if you watch dysfunctional relationships and boil it down and look at what's really going on, what's happening is that people are struggling over power issues so that they can feel valuable and safe. And one of the things they struggle with happens to be around money, because people know when they have money they get power. This is something women have never learned. We're just learning it now, that who makes the money gets to control and have power and have value. Did you notice that? This is how money gets dragged into this situation, or abundance. Whoever creates abundance in relationships gets the power and gets the value. So that's the third dynamic here. How you heal that wound is not really through the self-valuing, and not really from owning your own reality. It's from learning how to take care of yourself and being responsible for what? Well, going back on that other sheet, which I don't want to... Learning how to be responsible for your own finances is what stops the power struggles on that level. Pat and I don't have to fight about money anymore. Ask Marion. We discuss that every time I go down there. We don't have to fight about money, because I take responsibility for making my end of the bargain. He takes responsibility for making his end of the bargain. When I need to, what I'm doing with what I'm doing is none of his business. And vice versa. We take responsibility for generating that abundance ourselves, and we don't have to fight about money as a way to have power or value in a relationship or having our reality prevail. Because we each take responsibility for creating that abundance, so we don't have to fight about it. I have a shame-want bind, though. I still have a shame-want bind. And so that when I'm getting something I want and it costs money and I'm operating outside of Pat's values, what does that mean? Well, I'm getting something that he thinks is stupid. Never marry somebody whose values are different than yours. Unless you just want to have a lot of intensity. We have very different values. He values old cars. I value new ones. Or another way to say this is he values old Mercedes, and I value things that are a little newer than that. And anyway, so what happens is that when I have something I value that he devalues because he doesn't value it, that's all that means, and I want to get it, and I have to spend money to get it, and he wrinkles his nose about, my God, getting that. I have a tendency to have a shame attack and then not, in order to avoid the shame attack, not get what I want because I know I'm going to have to face him doing that on the other end of the line. You know what I mean? Let's see if I can think of a current thing that just happened with that sort of thing. Usually it has to do with, we're having a fight over furniture. I told you that to straighten out relationship, we built a bigger house. Well, another thing we have to do is put furniture in that. Now, Pat values, he'll probably hate me for saying this. This is what I think. I think it's right because I confronted him the other day on the decking with this, and he started laughing real hard, so I think I nailed him. He values, what do you call that? Where do you send your old furniture when you want to get rid of it? He values Salvation Army type furniture. I value barrels. Can you see we have a conflict? He wants sturdy. And he doesn't necessarily care what it looks like. He wants his dogs to be able to sit on it. So who cares what the thing looks like? It just needs to be sturdy so the dogs don't tear it up. And he can sit down on it with his oily pants and not have to worry about getting grease stains on it. I want white couches. I don't want the dogs on the couches, and I don't want his greasy jeans on the couches either. I want to go to Barrels and get a stark white couch because it looks good in the living room, and I like to sit in the chair and look at how nice it looks. He doesn't care about any of that. He doesn't value any of that. He wants early American Salvation Army so he can be comfortable. And I want Barrels so I can be comfortable because it makes me feel good to sit in a house that looks like it's come out of Bitter Homes and Gardens. Do you think we're going to have conflict? We have. I remember I got a friend of mine, Jeannie Beal, came and she's an interior decorator, and she came to tell me about how we could fix our house. While she was telling us about how we could fix the house, I noticed Pat just steaming, and when she left, he walked up to me in a huff and said, I want you to know if you do that to this house, I am going to live in the garage. In fact, right now, I'm going to go out in the garage and see how I can put air conditioning in that, because I know that's where I'm going to live if you do that. What are we in? We're in a values conflict and a power struggle about whose reality is going to prevail. Now, that's normal when you live with someone whose values conflict with you. There's only one way out of that, and it's called compromise. But how can you compromise if you feel as though when you're going to surrender your reality that you're going to lose and have your value drop and have a sense of your abundance dropping at the same time? You can't compromise. Have you ever noticed that it's a life and death struggle about what color the couch is going to be? Has that ever occurred to you that that is ridiculous and that normal, mature people don't get into that kind of struggle in the first place? They just compromise. If he wants white and you want red, you get orange or something like that, or a pink one. You don't get into those life and death struggles because that's what you're really struggling over, the value, the power, and the abundance. Because you don't have that inherent value. You can't claim your own reality. You don't know how to take care of yourself, and you're constantly trying to get that from the other person. They're constantly trying to hang on to their own and get it from you because neither one of you are mature people. And you get into those struggles which create great chaos in relationship. What's the underlying problem? The issue of shame. And the shame binds you have to your issues around self-care and self-valuing. Most relationship issues are a terrible struggle facing your partner and trying to get them to give you the value and give you the abundance so you can feel safe. Because both of you come from a position of defectiveness. And the culprit is the carried shame. In relationships, we keep these power struggles going by doing these things. This is what keeps the fight and the struggle going. We blame others for the distress in a relationship instead of looking at, hey, there's a problem here, how can we solve it? The first thing we do when a problem marches into our relationship is we assign blame. We figure out who's right or wrong. Why do we want to do that? If we can figure out that the other person is wrong, and of course they always are. Have you ever noticed that, how big your other finger is? And how you're about doing that to your partner? My mind just thinks that I still do it, even though I know it's really in my disease when I do it. I'm always about blaming Pat for absolutely everything, things he has nothing to do about. My mind can scoot around, so I'm always blaming him. That's so that I can rise up and he can be down and I can feel okay. It's terrible. The big blame. The second thing we do is we're always about keeping score on our partner. When they confront us with our poop, we keep score. We keep a long score, way back. So today when they confront us with our reality, we can tell them how they did it 40 times last week. Therefore, we don't have to deal with it. Right? Have you ever noticed that? Your partner says you left the window open, 3 times this week we lost heat and the energy bill is going up. And you say, well, you did that 40 times last month, last week, last year, 10 years ago. I counted. You have done that exactly 495.0005 times. I've only done it 2. It's your problem, not mine. That's called keeping score. So you don't have to face the reality of your impact of who you are. Third thing we do in this incessant power struggle is that we argue data to see whose reality will prevail. What happens in relationships, of course, is that everybody has differing reality, don't they? Yeah, have you ever noticed that? That facts are different? That you see facts different than your mate? And of course, yours is reality. You know what the truth is? Probably neither of you know what actuality is. All you know is what your perception is. That usually has nothing to do with facts or actuality. It's just your perception. And then we try to argue our mates into having our perception instead of honoring the fact that they have their own. And isn't that interesting? And that's what's going on with them, and making them feel loved by recognizing that and supporting them and having it. And when it conflicts with yours, just letting them know it conflicts and letting it go. We get into arguing data and try to have our reality prevail so that we can feel safe and we can have the power, we can have the value, and we can have the abundance. It's all crazy. And the fourth thing we do is that when all else fails and we feel ourselves losing the power struggle, guess what we always know we can do? Abandon our mate. We can always do that as a way of getting even and maintaining the sense of power. We can threaten abandonment, or we can actually abandon them so that we can finally win this terrible power struggle. The power struggle, again, is about who's going to have the value. Not really who's going to have the power, but who's going to have the value. It's a terrible thing, and that's how this issue of shame affects relationships. Of course, the question is, well, in recovery, what do normal people do? In recovery, what are we supposed to be doing? Well, basically, recovery is about facing our issues of maturity, facing our shame binds, working through them, learning how to value ourselves appropriately. When we're the kind of people that ride in the one-up position through perfectionism and judgment, we learn not to engage perfectionism, we learn not to be judgmental, and we learn not to look down on others. We're in the one-down position, we learn how to value ourselves appropriately so that both of us can look equally in another's eyes and know we have equal value. And when we lack shame, we learn how to experience shame so that we can set limits on our reality. So that when we enter relationships, we enter it with a sense of love on board and the ability to love the other person. The other thing we have to do is we have to learn to take care of ourselves. So that in the relationship, we don't have to absolutely have that other person supporting these issues for us, that we can support those for ourselves. We're valuing ourselves, we're bringing abundance into our life so we have our own power because we can make choices. It's in making choices that we get our true sense of power. It's in knowing deep within our hearts that we have value, that we have value. It's in making choices that we have power, and it's doing hard work that we have abundance. Adults take responsibility for doing all three of those things for ourselves. Where shame is bound to this issue of abundance, you will never have it. Where shame is bound to your value, you will never have it. When shame is bound to your reality, you don't have choices. All these things are eliminated, and in a very screwball way. We try to fight with another person in order to have that instead of learning how to generate it within by our own issues of self-valuing and self-care. This works, I will tell you that. I entered my relationship with Pat in a very from a position of a lot of felt sense of defectiveness. And guess what? The relationship didn't work because I was trying to get him to value me more than I was willing to value me. I was trying to get him to take care of me more than I was willing to take care of myself. In recovery, I had to stop all that. I had to learn to break all my shame binds so that I was free to value myself, protect myself, own the nature of who I was so that I knew what my needs and wants were, learned how to take care of my needs and wants, and now I noticed Something very interesting has happened in my relationship with Pat. He's changed. What I can tell you about that is he has not changed. I changed. And as I changed, I began to see him differently. You see, now, when we get into values conflict, or we get into reality conflict, what I can see is that that's Pat going on, and this is me going on. And I don't have to get the two mixed up. I can just keep making my own choices, keep valuing myself, keep taking care of myself. I can look at Pat and see that he's getting upset with me because I'm having this reality, I am buying these things or whatever I'm doing. And I can let him be upset as he wants to, as long as I'm not offending him. I will continue to do what I need to do over here to take care of myself. And I will also be able to appreciate and love him for who he is, because who he is doesn't affect me that much because I am in charge of my life. I am generating my own abundance. I am generating my own value. I am generating my own sense of power. I don't have to take it from him. I don't need him to give it to me. Therefore, we don't have to engage in all these power struggles anymore. Now, I'll tell you what. Most of the time, we don't blame each other. We just notice a problem and recognize it and deal with it and go on. We don't engage in that blaming anymore. We try not to keep score on each other. We don't argue facts. That's probably the greatest relief. When we notice we have conflicting reality and we notice neither one of us are going to change, we just stop talking. We change the subject and talk about something else and go on about our business. The other thing that's happened is I like him a lot better. And again, he hasn't changed. I like him a lot better because I like me a lot better. And I don't have to have him be a certain way in order for me to be comfortable any longer. I can just appreciate him for what he is. And what I'm discovering is he's quite a hoot. Even if we do have conflicting values. And nothing is about him changing. Although he has changed because he's in his own recovery and he's done a lot of changing as he's needed to change. But really, most of what has made me comfortable with him has nothing to do with him. It has to do with me becoming comfortable with me. It has nothing to do with him. Because I know no matter what, I can now take care of me. I don't have to rely on him to do that. I can value me. I don't have to rely on him to value me anymore. I can take ownership of who I am. I don't have to have him tell me who I am. I don't rely on him for those things anymore. I don't rely on him for my value, for my power, or for my abundance. That allows me to love him and not engage in these terrible power struggles. And that's all I have to tell you tonight. I hope you all got it. Thank you for coming.